very hard ancient rocks. They don't yield much in the way of the nutrients to feed the base of the food chain, the plants, the fertilizers, if you like, the nitrates, the phosphates. And the water's dark, so it blocks the light, vital for the photosynthesis. So it doesn't have a huge productivity, and that's one of the arguments that come into the scene when you're talking about Loch Ness monsters. Is there enough food, for example? The view nowadays is that there isn't enough food for a resident population, a viable population of large predators. Though, of course, things can come in, animals can come in, like the salmon, from the sea, up the River Ness, because the loch is connected to the sea via the River Ness.
And how does the bottom of the loch looks like, and were the scientists ever able to go down?
Yes, I have been to the bottom of Loch Ness in a submarine, and we've had our cameras down at the bottom of it as well. We explain that in the fourth room of the exhibition, and we show the video of our attempts on the bed of the loch. We also take sediment core samples out of the sediment, which reveal the history of the loch. We've managed to get 6 meters of sediment core down at a water depth of 200 meters, which was quite a task for us, but we were successful.
And you saw it with your own eyes, so how is it down there?
It's very dark, it's very flat. The bed of the loch is very flat, although the walls are very steep and rocky, but down on the soft silt plain at the bottom at 200 meters plus, it's very flat. It's a bit like we picture the surface of the moon, where it is flat. You know, it's quite red, because the water has this red filter effect on light that goes into it.
Mm-hmm. And did anything change in the last decade in terms of the water in the loch, the quality of the water, and the actual species that live there?
We have just taken another sediment core to send to University College London to be compared to the results we got over 20 years ago with the same exercise, to see whether the diatoms are changing at all. Because when we did the job before, back in the 1990s, there was an increase in the planktonic diatoms as opposed to the benthic ones, that is, the ones in the midwater as opposed to the ones down on the mud. And there was a big increase, which was suggestive, no more than suggestive, of enrichment, that the loch might be getting more nutrients, possibly from human activities like sewage or fertilizers on forestry, that sort of thing. And we've just taken another one to see whether there is a difference.
And you're still waiting for this result from
Oh,
this
yeah.
year,
That'll be at least a year, yeah.
We should check in a year time. Great, Adrian. And moving on to Loch Ness monster itself, what it is?
The Loch Ness monster is, I think, an amalgam, a mixture of all sorts of different things that people see that they don't understand. Because a lot of our brain is concerned with making sense of what we're seeing. And if you see something in Loch Ness that you don't understand immediately, then what should it be? Obviously it should be the Loch Ness monster, because that's what's in Loch Ness. And we'd all like to see something unusual, wouldn't we? So there is an expectation which is unconscious, which means that if you see something unusual, that is a conclusion you'll come to. Now, unusual things happen in Loch Ness because of its nature, because of this long, straight, regular profile, for example. It's a wind tunnel from winds from the southwest, which are our prevailing wind. They can move the surface water, the warmer surface water, up to one end. If the wind drops, it flows back. There are big underwater waves, but the main point is that the water on the surface can move against the wind. And so if you've got logs or bits of tree on the surface, they can move against the wind, giving the impression of swimming. That's one thing. So that's where a little bit of general science sheds a lot more light into the subject than any amount of looking at the loch with cameras and binoculars. Also perception, size perception is very difficult over water. If you are looking at water on a day like this where there are waves, you can judge distance to some extent and thereby size. But in calm water, and especially if there's any mist, it's very difficult to judge distance and hence size. And so even water birds can look much bigger than they actually are. So the place conspires both by our expectations and the illusions for which it is capable in creating monsters. And there will always be a Loch Ness monster as long as we want there to be one.
Does it disregard the actual existence of the Loch Ness monster? What you just said, or?
Well, I've just defined it. Is anything in Loch Ness you see that you don't understand? That is a Loch Ness monster. Whether it's a boat wake, whether it's a piece of tree, whether it's another animal, it could be any of those things. But all of them are Loch Ness monsters
Well,
under the circumstances.
But still, there was some sign of a monster that many people saw, and some of their descriptions are quite similar.
And some of them very different.
Some of them are very different. If we're talking about this monster, could it be just a single species, or is it like a group of species?
Well, nobody ever suggested that it was just one. Well, none of the investigators suggested just one monster, except at the very beginning of the investigation in the 1930s, when it was thought that perhaps something had come up the River Ness and become stuck, it was trapped in Loch Ness. So that was one time when they were thinking about just one. But then by the 50s, people were talking about a population of monsters in the loch, perhaps before they understood about the food chains and the productivity. So the thing has evolved from thinking of one thing that had got in 1933 to a population in the 1950s, and now we are back at the beginning again, where we accept that it's conceivable that something might come up the river and be around for a little while, like a sturgeon, as you have in Russia. But we don't actually have records of them in Loch Ness